This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Afreichem Purim, everyone. Shalom Aleichem. So, this Seder is an annual Seder. We have the Seder L'Kavod. First of all, the Yom Tov of Purim, which is a Yom of Kabbalas HaTorah. The Gemara says in Shabbos Peiches, Amar Avdimi, Bar Chama Bar Chosa, Melamed Shekava Aleim Har Kegigis, V'amar Lohem and Mekama Torah, Muta V'mlav Shomte, Kfuraschem, and Rabba Sama Rabba, Mikan Moida Rabba La'iraisa. But not until the times of Purim were we Mekabel the Torah, B'Ahava Hadar Kiblu B'Mei Achashverosh. And especially, Chassam Sofer tells us a haftacha that he has from his Rebbe, Rav Mendel Lilig, in the name of the Shav Yaakov, that anyone who learns Torah, Bein Megillah Delaila, Megillah Deyoim, Muftach Loi, Shu Ben Oilam Haba. And the Chidah tells us that if Klal Yisrael would be Noyeg on Yom Purim, B'Kedusha, be Oisek in the Mitzvahs Hayoim, and the rest of the day they would be Oisek with Talmud Torah, Bevadai we would destroy Amalek, and Bevadai we would destroy Amalek, and the Geula would happen. So I want to share with you maybe one or two different inyanim. I want to share with you a Chakira, the Brisker. The pasuk says, "O Mordechai yatzam milifnei hamelech." Mordechai went out before the king. Belvush malchus techelas v'chur, in royal clothing, blue wool, white wool. Va'atar zahav gedoyla, golden garments, a golden crown. V'sachrich boots v'argaman, and a cloak of linen and purple wool. V'ha'yer Shushan tzahalav samecha, and the city of Shushan was jubilant. So the Brisker Rav has the following chakira. Why was the city of Shushan Salav Samecha? Was the city of Shushan Salav Samecha because they saw that Mordechai left the king's palace wearing the royal clothing? Or is the Ha'ir Shushan Salav Samecha a separate clause, something that stands on its own? In other words, the pasuk doesn't say why Ir Shushan Salav Samecha. It is following the beginning of the pasuk that says Mordechai Yatzam Lefnei HaMelech B'Levush Malchus. But is that the reason they were Salav Samecha? Were they happy because Mordechai was wearing the royal clothing, or were they happy in general because their lives were saved? Says the Brisker Rav, this Chakira, we could come to a conclusion. We can answer this Chakira based on the Nusach of Shoshanas Yaakov. We say, Shoshanas Yaakov Tzahalav V'Samecha. When was Yaakov Tzahalav V'Samecha? B'roisam Yachad Tchelas Mordechai. They were happy when they saw the Tchelas. So when the pasuk says, "Mordechai yatzam lefnei hamelech belvush malchus tchelas v'chur," the ha'ir Shushan is not a separate clause. It's going on the fact that they saw that Mordechai was wearing the royal begadim. So this was the Chakira, the Brisker Rav, and the Brisker Rav was poishet. He came to a conclusion based on the nusach of Shoshanas Yaakov. But the question is, time aboy, we need a reason. Why was the fact that Mordechai was wearing these clothing, why was that a reason for them to be Tzahalav V'Samecha? Okay. So I'm sharing with you something from the Sefer Shalmei Toida, which is from one of the it's a Brisker Sefer on the Megillah, and he has really a wondrous approach to the whole mahalach of the hishtadlus of Mordechai. Because when Mordechai found out about the impending gezerah, Mordechai yadas kol asher na'asa, Mordechai knew everything that happened. Meaning, Chazal say he was told about this gezerah. Now, there are two options over here, or three options. Mordechai, the good news is, Klal Yisrael has a man in the White House. Their man, their woman, Esther, is married to the king. So the natural thing to do is that if there's a gzera on the Jewish people, let's contact Esther and see what she could do to bail us out. That would be one approach. Another approach would be tefillah. A third approach would be both. And it seems like in the Megillah, not only is very little hishtadlus done, Reb Dov Seidenfeld, where are you? You're still in Ukraine or something? Where are you? You're muted, I can't hear you. But very little hishtadlus was done. Not only was very little hishtadlus done, kemat no hishtadlus is done. How so? The very first thing that Mordechai does, Vayikra Mordechais begadav, he tears his clothing. Now, stam, that's a pella. What's that going to help? Vayobash sak va'efer, he puts on sackcloth. We have to understand, why is he putting on sackcloth? Vayetsei b'soy choyer, vayezak za'aka gedoyla umara. It's interesting, the first thing Mordechai does is he puts on the sackcloth. He cries out. He doesn't even contact Esther in the beginning. He's totally focused on the sackcloth. Now, typically, if there was a gzeira on somebody and they have a sister married to the king, that would be the first line of attack. The first hishtadlus would be, ask your sister, what could you do to bail me out? But by Mordechai yada, what does he do? Vayikra begadav, vayilbash sak va'efer. He was told that there is a gzeira on Klal Yisrael. Why? They bow down to the Tzelem and Tam Nebuchadnezzar. They were nene from the Suda of Achashverosh. And immediately, Mordechai goes into action to be mavatal gzeira, and he wears sackcloth, and he davens. Now, why is he wearing sackcloth? This is very important. If you look in the Medrash says, in the Medrash Rabbah, Parsha Esthers, that it's the derech hatfila of tzaddikim to wear sackcloth. The Medrash darshans on the pasuk, tzina v'soichera amitai. This is tefillah that protects a person like tzina. Tzina is armor. And tefillah, which is like tzina, was conquered Haman. This is the meaning, said the Medrash. Sak va'efer yutza larabim. What's the takon of sak va'efer? Sak va'efer are big day tefillah. So we see the first hishtadlus that Mordechai did, he didn't contact Esther. His first thing he does is he tears his clothing, he puts on big day tefillah, sak va'efer. Then, he doesn't take off the sak va'efer. He heads to the palace wearing sak va'efer. The problem is he knocks on the gate, they don't let him in. Ki ein lavai el shar hamelech bavur sak. So if you were Mordechai, what would you do? You'd take off the sak va'efer and you'd put on your kapata. You would take off the sak va'efer and you'd put on the kapata. No, he didn't want to take off the sak even for Zman Muat to speak with Esther. Listen to this. He could have taken off the sak va'efer. No, he doesn't take off the sak va'efer. He remains with his sak va'efer. So he calls a message to Esther. Listen, Esther, I'm wearing my sak va'efer and I can't come inside. So do me a favor. I want to let you know there's a gzeira on Klal Yisrael. So I don't understand, Mordechai. If you need to get Esther's attention, take off the sak va'efer for 2.5 minutes, go tell Esther the deal, and then you put on the sak va'efer. No. Mordechai would not be poiresh from the sak va'efer for 1 minute, even though you would say it's probably reasonable hishtadlus to take off the sak va'efer. No. He's not doing that. And then, what does Esther do? Esther says, look, Mordechai, I want to have a word with you. So Esther sends clean clothing to Mordechai. Does Mordechai put it in? The pasuk says, "Vatishlach begadim habishas Mordechai ulahasir sakoi me'olav v'loi kibel." Mordechai did not accept the good clothing. The Gra explains, "Loi ratza livdol meisakoi afilu rega echad." Mordechai said that the hishtadlus that I'm doing over here is not hishtadlus. My hishtadlus is tefillah. And therefore I will not go in. I'm going to put on my sak va'efer. And if they're not going to let me into the palace with sak va'efer, I will not take it off for a second, because I want to be mispalo the entire time. I'm going to go in, and I'm going to go into you, Meaning, I'm not gonna take it off for a moment. And even if you're gonna send me new clothing, I'm not putting it on. So Mordechai had to send a messenger, Daniel, to let Esther know what's going on. So says the son-in-law of the Brisker. Now we understand why Klal Yisrael was so happy. Beroisam yachad techelas Mordechai. Now we understand why Mordechai yatzam lefnei hamelech belvush malchus chelas v'chor then v'hoyer shushan tzalav smecha. Listen carefully. On that fateful day, when Haman came to Mordechai and he said, Mordechai, I'm going to parade you on the royal horse and with the royal clothing, and Mordechai did so. Does anybody remember? Even though the tables had began to turn, even though things were changing, nevertheless, what was happening? Who remembers? What was the very first thing that Mordechai did after he rode the royal horse and wore the royal clothing? Vayashav Mordechai el shar hamelech. Mordechai returned to the gate of the king. And what do you think he did there? Says the Medrash, Melamed sheshav lesakoy ulatanisoi. He went right back to the sackcloth. Mordechai, but the tables are turning. Why are you still davening with sackcloth? Why are you still davening this way? Why is he going right back to the sackcloth and the ashes? The answer is, even though the tide was turning and it looked like the Yeshua was coming, but nevertheless, Mordechai had no guarantees. The Gezerah was still in place. Mordechai would not separate from the davening and the sackcloth even for one iota of time. So think about it. From the moment Mordechai knows about the Gezerah, he tears his clothing. He puts on the sackcloth. He wants to go let Esther know in the sackcloth. They don't let him in. Mordechai says, okay, I'm not taking off the sackcloth. I guess I won't be able to tell Esther. Esther sends a message. Here, Mordechai, here's new clothing. Mordechai loy kibel. He wouldn't put it on. Then, when he takes it off because the king ordered that Haman should parade him around in the royal clothing, the moment that whole charade is over, he's right back at the sackcloth. Which means Mordechai understood the Iker Hishtadlus, the Iker efforts in this world is Tefillah, 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 Meitchilasoi Viad Soifai. You know, it's very interesting. They asked Reb Chaim Kanievsky, what Hishtadlus do you do to make a Parnasa? Chaim said, what do you mean? On both days of Rosh Hashanah, I'm mispalel, Hashem should give me Parnasa. That's my Hishtadlus. From the Purim story, you see the Iker efforts that a person should make is always Tefillah. So the son-in-law of the Brisker Rabbi Glatstein said like this. Now we understand. You know when Klal Yisrael was Tzohala v'Samecha, when they saw that Mordechai allowed himself to wear, he was Yatzam Lefnei HaMelech. Bilavush Malchus, Techelas, Vachur, Ba'ateres, Zahav Gedoyla, Besachrich, Boots Va'argaman. When Mordechai allowed himself to wear the royal clothing, and he stopped wearing the sackcloth, that meant his efforts in tefillah had come to a conclusion. Only then Klal Yisrael knew that it was a Geula Shalema. Because on the day that Mordechai was paraded on the royal horse, the moment after that, he's back to the sackcloth. Why? Because it was only the haschala of the gula, which means Mordechai was not going to be boidel from the sackcloth until it was a gula shlema. So when it was Mordechai yatzam l'fnei hamelech belvosh malchus techelas v'chur, then v'hoyer shushan so'alav v'samecha. Now, Esther's hishtadlus were likewise very similar. You would have expected, if Esther was going into the king, she would have, spent 6 months. Esther should have prepared herself to go before the king. But no, Esther had fasted 3 days straight. In fact, the Medrash says that Esther was so famished that the king said to her, Malach Esther Amalka. The Gra says that he saw her face was transformed because of the tinus. She couldn't hold her head up. And Achashverosh says, what's wrong with you? She was green. She could physically not hold her head up. Actually, the Medrash says that Achashverosh was so fuming at her that she came in so famished and pale that his eyes were burning. Meiroiv hakas v'hachema asher b'libai. But Esther understood that the ikar hishtadlos is not beautifying herself, not ingratiating herself with Achashverosh. The ikar hishtadlos is tefillah, tainus. That's the main hishtadlos in this world. By the way, it's interesting that the Gra said, just an interesting yediyah, that it's not that Esther Mamish fasted 3 days straight, because the Gra interprets like this: Vitsumo alai v'yal toichlu v'yal tishtu shloshim alai v'yom gam ani v'naroisai yatzum kein uv'chein avoyal amelch asher lo chados. The Gra interprets like this: you guys, you fast 3 complete days, 72 hours. But ani v'na'aroisai otsum kain. Me and my maidservants, we're going to fast kain, 70 hours. We're going to have to eat a little bit. Why? Because otherwise I'll be avay al melcha shaloi chadas. If I fast 3 consecutive days, I'll be entering before the king really unlawfully. There's a phenomenon that if somebody fasts 3 days straight, a very foul odor emanates from their mouth, like we find by Rabbi Lezer Ben Horkinus, and therefore, Esther could not go all the way and fast 3 consecutive days, but still she was so weakened by the fast that she could barely keep her head up b'chlal. Now, one last idea about the focus of Esther's hishtadlos was that Achashverosh said, after Esther said, Kinim karnu ani ve'ami lehashmit laharog li'abed, we were sold to be obliterated and destroyed. So Achashverosh asks, really? Mihu zeh ve'ezahu Hashem lo libay lasisken? Who would have the audacity to do that? So the pasuk says that Esther said, Va'toimer Esther ish sarve oyev haman hara hazeh. Esther said, ish sarve oyev. So literally she's pointing to Haman, but the Gemara says machvilei klape Achashverosh. She pointed to Achashverosh, and the Malach Gabriel came and moved her hand away to Haman. And it's interesting, the Gra asks, how could Esther make such a bad mistake at a time like this? I mean, she's basically, by making a mistake like this, pointing to Achashverosh, she's endangering her own life, she's endangering the life of the entire Jewish people. Achashverosh wants to know who's harming you. The last thing she should say is, you! Why did she do that? How could she do that? The Gra says that the practice of tzaddikim, when they talk to kings, is that they envision and imagine themselves as if they're standing and beseeching HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that was certainly the practice of Esther. And we know that the power of imagination is so strong that if in a person's mind they're thinking one thing, even if they want to say something else, what you're thinking will influence what you say. So if let's say you want to call Ruvain, but you're thinking of Shimon, you're going to say, Shimon, you knew you were supposed to call Ruvain. The problem, but since you were thinking of Shimon, you may say Shimon. Says the Gra, Esther knew she was standing in front of Achashverosh. And she knew, heaven forbid, to point to Achashverosh. She needs to point to Haman. But she got so caught up in this saintly practice of speaking to Achashverosh, but imagining she was standing in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that when she was asked, who wants to do this to you? What happened was, in her mind, she's standing before God. So when God asks her, who's doing this? She says the truth. She points to Achashverosh. So again, you see that for these tzaddikim, the ikar hishtadlos was their tefillah, was their dveikus HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was the tainus, not the efforts they were making. You see by Mordechai that the ikar hishtadlos was the sakva efer. if he has to take off the sack wafer, he's not going into the king's palace. And when they didn't let him in, he wouldn't take it off and put on. And Esther sent him fresh clothing, v'loy kibel. And after he rides a royal horse, he goes right back to the sak ve'efer. So Klal Yisrael knew that this gezerah is not batel until Mordechai yatzam ifnei hamelech b'vosh malchus techelas v'chor. Until Mordechai would not stop davening until the geula was a geula shlema. So this is a very important yesod we see from Megillas Esther of the real hishtadlus in this world is our tefillah and our dveikus HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, the Rambam learns that the great Yom Tif of Purim is a celebration of the efficacy of tefillah. The reason Hashem saved us in the time of Purim is not because of anybody's hishtadlus. It's because of the tefillahs, that's divrei hatzoimos v'za'akasam. So every year on Purim, that Kayach HaTfilah renews itself, and we should take advantage of this Yom HaTfilah. Who doesn't need a Yeshua in some area? May HaKadosh Baruch Hu answer all of our tefillahs, Barachim and Varatzain. Thank you everybody for joining. Afrei Lechem Purim. You should all be Zoicha to the great Havtacha of Chassam Sofer, that anyone who's Oisek B'Torah, Ben Megillah, Delaila, or Megillah D'Yom, Muftach Lo Yishu Ben Olam Haba. We should be Zoicha to eradicate Amalek and to bring the Gula Shlema. Thank you, everybody. Afrei Lechem Purim. Shkayach. Thank you very much. Afrei Lechem, Afrei Lechem. Shkayach, Afrei Lechem Purim. Afrei Lechem Purim. Thank you.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.